It's a long story. What happened was Steve Adler, the original drummer for Guns N' Roses, he and I met when we were about 13. We basically ditched the seventh and eighth grade together.
In the golden days before the chaos, before the record-breaking tours and the global headlines, Guns N' Roses wasn't just a band, it was a it's a rebellious brotherhood, a tightly wound gang of misfits determined to storm the gates of rock royalty. At the heart of that early magic was Steven Adler, a drummer whose style wasn't just timekeeping, it was feel, swing, and attitude all rolled into one. Adler wasn't just some guy behind the kit. He was a founding heartbeat of a band that would later define an era. Slash and Adler had been childhood friends, bonded by poverty, broken homes, and dreams of loud guitars in packed arenas. In the early days, they rehearsed in cramped rooms, lived in roach-infested apartments, and played any grimy club that would have them. What they lacked in money, they made up for in reckless passion and electric chemistry. That chemistry exploded. Onto the world stage in 1987 with Appetite for Destruction, an album that didn't just climb charts, it kicked the door in. Adler's drumming had a bounce, a looseness, a swing that gave the band its unique swagger. Songs like Welcome to the Jungle, Sweet Child O' Mine, and Paradise City were built on that unrelenting groove. Adler wasn't flashy, but he was unforgettable. And yet at the very height of this success, just as the band was about to take on the world with their massive Use Your Illusion project, Steven Adler was cast out. The official reason? His drug addiction made him unreliable. But Adler would later tell a much darker story, one filled with betrayal, manipulation, and what he describes even now as a hit job that ripped him away from the only family he ever really had. The story of Adler's fall is both familiar and tragic, but no less devastating for its predictability. Like so many musicians in the whirlwind of 1980s fame, Adler found solace and escape in heroin. The way he tells it, it wasn't just about partying, it was about numbing pain, silencing fears, and chasing a feeling of invincibility that only the drug could provide. In interviews, Adler has recounted how the first hit of heroin made him feel like a king. But that high came at a steep price. As the band began working on new material, Adler's performance started to suffer. He'd show up late, not often, the studio, or play with less consistency. The band, especially Axl and Slash, grew frustrated. They gave him warnings. They gave him ultimatums. They even had him sign a contract before Use Your Illusion that stated he'd be penalized financially for every relapse. Adler, for his part, didn't deny his struggles. He admitted to trying and failing to stay clean, to being sick, and to needing help. But he also claimed the very treatments he was using to get off heroin, like opiate blockers, made it nearly impossible for him to play drums properly. And just when he thought he was finally getting better, the band cut the cord. The final straw, according to the band, came during the recording of the song Civil War, where Adler allegedly couldn't get through a usable take. He was fired shortly afterward. But Adler insists he was set up, that he wasn't given a fair chance, that his bandmates had already found his replacement, Matt Sorum, and were simply going through the motions of giving him a final test he was never meant to pass. They just wanted me out, he said more than once. I was sick, but I was getting better. They didn't care. Whether it was a calculated business move or the consequence of a band unraveling under pressure, the decision devastated Adler. He was stunned, blindsided, and heartbroken. After building the band from the ground up, after years of struggle and triumph, he was suddenly just another casualty of the rock and roll machine. What followed was a spiral that Adler himself would describe as a kind of living hell. While Guns N' Roses ascended into the stratosphere and into the globe, selling out stadiums and becoming one of the most iconic rock bands in history, Adler watched from the sidelines. Exiled from the dream he helped create, his life quickly unraveled. The addiction that had once been a coping mechanism now became a full-blown affliction. Arrests followed. So did failed rehab attempts. In 1996, he suffered a stroke brought on by drug use, which affected both his speech and motor skills. The world that had once cheered his name now watched his downfall play out in real time. His appearance on Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew exposed just how broken he'd become, both physically and emotionally. To get through all the despair, Adler never stopped mourning the loss of his bandmates. He spoke time and again of missing the brotherhood more than the fame. "All I ever wanted was my band back," he cried during one painful episode. He wasn't looking for money, he wanted the bond, the music. The late-night hangs in dingy clubs when they were nobodies, with a shared purpose. That grief never left him. In interviews, he'd talk about the music they never got to make, the tours he never got to join, and the way it felt to be cut out of something that once defined his entire identity. "We were a unit," he once said, "and I broke that. I wasn't strong enough to beat my demons when it mattered most. I have to live with that every single day." Yet even in the shadows, Adler never completely disappeared. There were brief flickers of redemption, moments where the old brotherhood stirred back to life. In 2012, when Guns N' Roses was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Adler was included and took the stage alongside Slash, Duff McKagan, Matt Sorum, and Gilby Clarke. Axl Rose and Izzy Stradlin were notably absent, and the performance was bittersweet, but for Adler, it was still a moment of deep validation. Then, in 2016, during the Not in This Lifetime reunion tour, Adler made a few emotional guest appearances, performing out "TA Get Me" and "My Michelle" with the band he helped create. For fans who'd watched him suffer for decades, seeing him back on stage with Slash and Duff felt like healing. Adler himself described those moments as euphoric. It's just to be up there with Slash and Duff again. "It felt like a dream," he said. But those dreams were fleeting. His appearances were limited, his involvement temporary. It was clear that while he was welcome as a guest, he was no longer part of the core. The bond had frayed too much. The years too long, the damage perhaps too deep. Then came the 2019 incident, a self-inflicted stab wound that was later ruled an accident, but which again put his fragility into public view. Through it all, Steven Adler remains a tragic yet heroic figure in the annals of rock history. He's the drummer whose style helped define a generation, who tasted the heights of fame and the depths of despair, and who still, to this day, carries the ache of being left behind. His story is a reminder of how thin the line can be between legend and loss, and how sometimes the deepest scars aren't from the drugs or the fame, but from the feeling that the people who once called you brother decided one day to walk away.